Okay, hello. So in this quick video, I want to go over, based on an issue raised on the GitHub for CoreLMS, I want to go over how the database system works inside of CoreLMS. Not in a tremendous amount of detail, but just kind of a general overview so that if you're at least familiar with some of the basic concepts, you should be able to jump in and understand what's going on at least. So the question was, is there a database file included with the repository to help you get going with CoreLMS? Now, first of all, CoreLMS is in the very, very, very early stages of development, so there's you can't like clone the repo and open a learning management system business. So keep that in mind, first of all. Second of all, no, because that's not how database is handled inside of CoreLMS. So what we use in CoreLMS, or what I use in CoreLMS, is Entity Framework Core. It is an ORM, or Object Relational Mapper. I'm not going to go into detail on what that is, how it works, the logistics and ins and outs of using that necessarily here. I'll show you the stuff that's relevant to CoreLMS in just a second. But no, there is no database file, no, what are they called, backpack files for SQL Server or anything like that that you can just, you don't need it. First, you just don't need it. Because I use Entity Framework Core, it's built into the system. It is a code-first approach to managing your database. So I will show you how that works and how, if you download CoreLMS from scratch, you can get your database installed and updated and all that stuff and so forth. So let's hop over to code. The central component of an Entity Framework database system is the DB context, database context. It is a class, and you see here I've got it broken into partial classes, partial class files, and I'll show you that in a second. Mine is called app.db context. It extends the DB context class and implements the iAppDB context interface. And I'll show you that in a second as well, so we can see how that maps. The DB context is responsible for setting up all the configuration that you need for your DB context. So at runtime, it sets up relationships in certain cases. It sets up soft deletes. It does a few things. Basically, it's set up for your database access. In this case, you'll see one DB set here, and that's because I haven't really figured out where I want to stick that yet. But I'll show you where the rest of them go. But a DB set is, think of it like your table. So I have a table that would translate to author course lessons, and that would be that table would represent the relationship between an author and a course lesson. It's a many-to-many table. So a record in the author course lessons table would represent one author that's a part of one course lesson. So that's what a DB set is, and it gives you the access to the code features you need, like adding, updating, deleting, fetching, all that stuff from the database. Then we have our configuration set up, and I have some temporary stuff here that I'm going to work on later. In the onConfiguring method, you can see I've got it set up to use SQL Server. This is where you could also do use in memory, memory cache. Memory cache, that's not the right one. Anyway, that's where you define what's backing your data, like what's your database actually going to be on. In this case, we're using SQL Server. Nothing to change there. And then we set up our model on creating stuff to handle soft deletes and many-to-manys and so forth. Not too much interesting there. Get rid of whatever those changes were, and we'll continue. There we go. So the next thing I have is another partial class file for authors specifically. And you'll see I have one for authors, I have one for courses, where are they? Courses, and then I'll have a course lessons one, and so on and so forth. Basically, each entity or table in the system will have its own file like this. And that's where you'll see I have the DB set defined, and I have methods defined for the basic select, all, select by ID, create, update, and delete. So the basic CRUD operations, I've sort of built methods around those operations. This is sort of a hybrid of a repository pattern. So rather than having a completely separate repository infrastructure, I build in the methodology that I like from the repository pattern onto my DB set, or onto my DB context rather. So what this does is it gives me uniform interfaces to create, read, update, and delete authors or courses or course lessons. Having these separate methods also means that I can mock them and unit test them more efficiently. So that's what those are there for. That's the point of those. Let's take a look next at, so then we have our interface, which again is so that we can mock and unit test, but it just does the same thing. It spells out the methods that we have that we're going to define. So when I look at this authors one, we have a DB set of type author, and it's called authors, just the name of that property, which translates to the table authors. Very straightforward. This author that the DB set is another class, and this is the entity. This is the column definition for the table authors. So you'll see I have an ID, date created, date updated, deleted, first name, middle name, last name. I have some data annotations to require certain fields or to enforce formats on certain fields, etc. Just a very basic class that represents an author in my system in code that gets translated to the table definition in the database itself. So that's what those components are, and you'll see that echoed and iterated over. By the time we get through with this system, it'll be a lot of them. We'll have authors, courses, students, lessons, attachments, registrations, sales, order information, all kinds of stuff. So that's going to continue to grow. Now, in terms of the database itself, so let me pull up SQL Server Management Studio, and I will show you the database, and we will delete it, and I'll show you how to recreate it from scratch as if you had just cloned this repository and want to get started developing against it. So I'm going to connect, to LocalDB. Here is my database, CoreLMS. There are my tables. There's the authors table, like I said before. And here are the columns, those same columns that are defined on the object. Very straightforward. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to delete this whole database. There's nothing in there that I need. So we'll get rid of that. And now I'm going to come back to Visual Studio. Now, to do this, to add migrations or to update the database, you can either use the the .NET command line interface. So if you are not on Windows or you just don't use Visual Studio, you can use the .NET command line interface for it. I use Visual Studio, so I prefer just to stay in one window. So I use Package Manager Console. It's basically the same thing. The syntax is slightly different. Nothing terribly crazy. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is how we would make changes to our database. So say I want to add a new field here, and we'll call it, we'll make it a string, and we'll call it their favorite language. That's what we're going to have. So we're going to add this string to our author entity. How do I get that to be reflected in the database? Very simply, in Package Manager Studio. So first, I will make sure that my default project is set to my persistence or database, data persistence project, because that's where all the infrastructure and migrations are defined. And then the other thing you have to do is make sure that the web project in CoreLMS, that the web project is set as your default startup project, because that's where the runtime configuration is specified. And I'll show you that as well. So if we look at app settings, .json, that's where I've got my connection string defined to the local database. So to use Package Manager Console, and it's the same thing roughly on the command line interface, you have to have the startup project set to CoreLMS.web and point to the persistence project as your default project. So once that's done, I can type in add migration, and we'll say this is the, what did I say it was? Favorite language. So I'm going to say this is the add favorite language property to author migration. So I'll run that. It's going to do a build, make sure everything compiles correctly. There that goes. And then in just a second, we will get, there we go. So we have a new migration file added. And you can see these migration files go under CoreLMS.persistence/migrations. And here is our new add favorite language migration. And you can see that what it does is it adds a column called favorite language that's a string to the table authors. And it gives it an nvarchar max type. Very straightforward. And now next I want to make that change in the actual database. I want to actually update my database to show that. Now I just deleted it, so it's nothing there to update. So what's going to happen? Well, first it's going to create it because it doesn't exist. It's going to apply each of these migrations in order so that starting from when I first began developing the system to now, each of my migrations is applied in order so that the database is brought to the correct current state. And to do that, all I have to do is run update database. And there we go. Okay, and now that's done. So it's gone through, it's created a database, it has applied each of those migrations. And if I come back over here and I refresh the databases folder, there's CoreLMS. There is my authors table, and I have that new column favorite language. Awesome, fantastic. So that's the basics of how you manage the database in Entity Framework Core in terms of the things that you might want to do. Now, I want to get rid of that because I don't need a favorite language. One second. I want to get rid of that because I don't actually need the favorite language column on my database table. So what I'm going to do, the way I do that is I'm going to say update database again. I'm going to specify the name of the migration before the one I just did. So not add favorite language, but author person update is the name that I want to go back to. Okay, and that's going to execute the down method of that migration. You can see reverting migration, add favorite language property to author. So it ran this, which dropped the column favorite language from authors. And then the last thing I want to do is remove migration. And you need to do it that way and not just delete the file, because there's this appdb context model snapshot that needs to be updated. So unless you want to go in there and manually mess with that code, use the remove migration command to handle that. So it got rid of that last migration that I applied. The file's no longer here. It updated the model snapshot. That's this thing, and we're good to go. And now if I do update database again, it should just tell me there are no changes to make. Of course, you have to type the command correctly. Update database. Build succeeded. No migrations were applied. Database is already up to date. And now if I come back over here and I refresh the columns, that column is gone. So there you go. That is the very basics of how database management is done, including in how you would install a fresh instance of the database locally, in this case using SQL Express or SQL Server, whatever you have. And that's why there's not a database file, so to speak, included in the repository, because it's code first. That's how the database infrastructure is handled in this project, at least for now. I think it'll stay that way. But there you go. So if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up. You can of course continue asking in the GitHub repository, raise issues, and I'll be happy to chat there with you. You can also come hang out on the Twitch streams on Monday and Wednesday. You can hit me up on Twitter. I'm at FitzyCodes. however you want to get in touch with me, or you can email me at fitzy@fct.dev. So, however you want to get in touch with me, happy to chat with you about this. Again, this is a system very much in early development. It's a learning project for me. I'm learning new concepts like test-driven development and trying to adhere to a more clean architecture or clean code architecture. So yeah, pace is it's gonna pick up. But it's still gonna be a while yet before we have a usable system here. So the purpose was not to release a product into the wild. It was for me to learn some things and end up with a product that I will use in the future. In any case, thank you for watching. Again, if you have any other questions, please get in touch. I'll be happy to help, and we'll see you around. Thanks.